For as long as there's been rock and roll, Tom Wichkowski has been making music. A Juno nominated producer, acclaimed singer songwriter, and musician, Tom has performed from coast to coast to England and beyond. Half a century of making records, friends, and memories brings us here to Tom's place.
The natural home of a producer is always presumed to be the studio. But not everything takes place in the studio. There's lots to do before you even get there. First of all, you have to go through a period of pre-production. You have to go through the rehearsals. You have to work on the songs. And it's also a time where the producer and the artist form a relationship and an understanding what role either of them will be playing in the process of this project. To do all of this in a studio would obviously cost hundreds, if not thousands of dollars a day. So unless you're the Rolling Stones, who have that ultimate budget as they do, they'll go in with their entourage and all their hangers on and their equipment, and they'll sit there and then create. But not everybody has this luxury to do it in the studio, so we're going to start off in a rehearsal. There are different kinds of producers. Today let me concentrate on the guy that produces bands. Guys like Phil Spector, Phil Ramone, George Martin, who are some of my favorites. Music-oriented producers. Well, now, to begin with, Dan, your first contact with a band would most likely be a live performance. A producer likes to go out and see a band. And if that isn't possible, then a rough demo tape. At this point, you can sort of tell the relationship between the musicians and their audience, what their material is like. It's not going to tell you all the facets of this band, but it's the way it starts. You know, Dan, if a band does have the ability to excite an audience, or you as a producer, well, that can take you to the next step, and then a demo tape will allow you to be more critical of the assessment of the material. It will be your job to transform this crude demo and start formulating ideas as to how this band should be produced. You know, today we're going to concentrate on the producer that can spot the potential of a band. You know, sometimes it just takes a verse and a chorus to know that these guys or this writer has what he needs to have to develop a song. It's the guidance thereafter that will help. Now, today, it should also be said that there's a lot of good high-tech equipment available at low cost. And sometimes bands will make demos, and because of their inability in the production aspect, you know, a very well-recorded song will hide its brilliance under the poor production. Or in turn, a badly recorded demo will also hide what could potentially be good. Well, Dan, you know, once a producer has spotted the potential in a song, then my next job would be to think of ways to develop this potential and how it can be realized. A musical-oriented producer, as opposed to one with an engineering background, may start thinking about arrangements and the structure of a song. You know, sometimes just rearranging the whole thing before even entering the studio. A lot of times the producer will sit down with the artist and say, okay, Dan, I like this song, but, it needs to have a bridge. And I'll explain to you why. Because it's that third step, as in a book, you have the beginning, you have the epilogue, and then you have the center. Well, it's the same thing in a song. You have a verse, you have a chorus, you have a bridge. And sometimes the bridge is sort of not used, and instead there'll be a guitar solo or something, right? And in the case of a lot of hit bands, like the Beach Boys again, or the Beatles, or the Eagles, they will have a verse, a chorus, a bridge, and a solo, So now we're sitting down, we're tearing over the song. Okay, we're happy with the music now, Dan. Now we have to go look at the lyrics. Okay, I gotta say to you, that second verse is very infantile. We're gonna have to rewrite some of those words. You're gonna have to trust me on this one. Because in the end, what I'm looking for is what's going to be accepted on the radio or by the listener. So a lot of times what will happen in productions is a producer with a musical background, not all producers, but a guy that was actually a player himself, right? He will come along and he will help rewrite passages of the music or rewrite passages of the words. And so you'll notice on a lot of the old records like Phil Spector and so on, Brian Wilson, whoever they produce, they will have writing credits on some of the songs. Well, that's not because originally that's the way it was set out to be. It's just the way it was developed. And of course, there's a bit of money involved. However, that's worked out between the producer and the artist. But sometimes that's a necessity.
How, as a producer, do you deal with writer dynamics? Someone who comes in with a very set vision in their head that this is why I hear it, this is the way I want it down. It's not going to make radio, and it has some fundamental flaws. You know that this is more or less it's a wounded duck right off the get go. But it's going to be a roadblock from producing a full album.
Okay, well that's easy to answer. Find another producer, or this fool is offering me so much money that I say to him, find another producer.
Cut.
It's as simple as that. And I mean that, truly. In the early days, I might have, and I did take a lot of work, which I knew was going to be garbage. But at the time, I should have actually said that. Well, again, Dan, with, like having watched other producers work as well, like watching Tony Ashton produce, or, watching Jack Richardson produce, or Jack Douglas, or Lachlan McFadden. They all had their styles, but, they all had something so powerful to contribute. I remember a Copper Penny session at RCA in Toronto where, during the session going on, Jack Richardson would come out and he'd say, okay, give me the bass guitar. And he'd go, now can you maybe play this? And you'd sort of stand back and you'd go, yeah, now I see where Jimmy Cale got that line with the Guess Who, or where so-and-so got that line with Poco, or where so-and-so got that line, because this producer actually could say, okay, give me the instrument, let me play that bass line, or drummer, can you just do it like da-da, 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 bam, right? You know, all the songs have been arranged. The musicians have been decided upon. The pre-production is essentially done. The rehearsals have been completed. You're ready for the studio. Now, how do you select that studio? Well, me as being a musician-oriented producer, I like to find a studio, first of all, where I have a relationship with the engineer, or I can sort of get to know the guy in advance and know, can I work with this guy? Now, I've done situations where, over the years, Dan, where I've gotten into a studio and where the engineer has tried to sabotage my production. Because, I'll say, this is what I'm looking for. And he'll go, well, I think this might be a little bit better. Well, pal, when you're hired to be the producer, then you can make that decision. But in the meantime, you dial the knobs the way I want you to dial the knobs. And then the physical acoustics of the studio. Also, there's certain studios that are more suited for pop music, and there's some studios that are more suited for country music. It's like if you're doing an orchestra, for instance, Dan, you want to make sure that you have a big studio room with high ceilings that have some hard surfaces for the string arrangements, the horn arrangements. That's a different situation. If you're doing a pop record, you want to make sure that you have a nice, tight studio where you can control the sounds and have an engineer you can trust. I should just add about the session there, Dan, something that's sort of I like to do myself is I like to work in a studio only as long as my ears don't fatigue. Sometimes I've found doing sessions where you're doing marathon 12, 16-hour sessions, after a while, first of all, the musicians aren't as productive. They're not as fresh. And I'm not as fresh. My ears start to fatigue and it's time to have a rest, right? But let's say the sessions have finished now. The recording is all done. The next step, of course, is mixing. And generally what I'll do is I'll take rough mixes home and I'll listen to them and I'll make my notes. And then perhaps a week later I will go in and start mixing. And at that point I would invite the writer of the band, which is usually one person, in with me while we're doing the mix. He will be there to observe, and I certainly am always open to listening to ideas because, I'm presenting him, and sometimes they'll come up with a brilliant idea that I might not have thought of. So that's all a good thing. So let's say now we've mixed the record. Now we have to decide on a running order. Well, to me, a running order is crucial. It's absolutely crucial. That's why I don't like this MP3 stuff, where they can put on a shuffle thing. Well, that's not the way records are made. There's a reason why Neil Young puts this song here, this song here, this song here, this song here, because that's the way he wants you to listen to the project. And if it's a concept album, like, let's say Dark Side of the Moon, or the Desperado album by the Eagles, well, if you listen to it out of sequence, it almost doesn't make sense because it's kind of a following storyline where it goes from Desperado to Dueling Daltons and so on and so on. You get the idea of what I'm saying here. Okay, so you've decided on the running order. Then the next thing you can do is help the artist in the guidance of their artwork. Perhaps they're not too in tune with publishing or copyright. And let's say they've done a remake of a song. Well, then you have to help them to secure the rights to be able to actually release that, to get the initial okay from the original publisher. So you've covered the mixing, you've covered the artwork, you've covered the publishing. The next thing you can do as a producer is guide them as far as where should they be sending this, who should they be going to see, and hire a good lawyer.
Tom, tracking sequence in a rock band, four-piece rock band, take for example, okay, the type of guys that you're probably going to get demos from. Are you going to record the band as a whole, or would you break it down and get bed tracks? What's your tracking sequence?
Well, okay, Dad. First of all, a four-piece band never ends up being a four-piece band because I'm the kind of producer. I'm still the old style, sort of Phil Spector or George Martin or those guys. I double track vocals. So first of all, that can't be done all at once, right? And I'm a big one on overlaying background guitars. Like, even if it's a rock band, there'll likely be acoustics in there, left and right. So it ends up being more than four. So that eliminates that all can be done at once. I do like to record as live as possible. I may only be doing the drum track and the bass track, but I like to have the guys play together because that creates the best feel, you know. So, but I record it all. I record it all because sometimes you get lucky. So that's the way I like to track.
Tom, personality dynamics. You have it's a human element. You're going to have conflicting personalities. You're going to have people who may be able to take direction well. You may have other rebel elements in there, that people that don't take direction well, goof offs. You know what I mean, one timers. But you see the potential in this, and you need to bring this together. Substance stuff, people, off their nut. Where do you go?
Yeah. Well, of course, Dan, all of those elements have come into sessions that I've produced. You can't always govern what people will do to themselves, with the drugs or with the alcohol or whatever it might be. Certain people have certain crutches. I don't allow it to happen in the studio. What they do outside of the studio, I absolutely have no control over. But with people dynamics, a producer in a lot of ways is also like an umpire. Because most of the conflicts you'll find in sessions is between the musicians themselves, right? So you go out and you go, now, okay, Dan, you're going to have to play a little bit closer with Bill. And here's what I'd like you to do, okay? Bill is doing this and he's doing a nice job. Why don't I have you do this on a different register? And let's try this out. And if that doesn't work, you guys can switch parts. We'll try that out, okay? So a producer in a lot of ways is forever the diplomat and the peacekeeper and keep it rolling. Guys start to goof off. That sometimes you have to allow because they get to a point where they've worked so hard that they need a breather. And at that point, it's always good to say, let's have a 10-minute smoke break. Go get a cup of coffee. We'll go back at this in 15 minutes. Sure, the time is clicking, but sometimes it's necessary because when they come back, there's a new, fresh approach again. So, you got to be a diplomat.
First timers, never played with session musicians before. Rock star mentality. Dealing with the shock that they're not going to be the ones playing on the record. How do you introduce the concept of session musicians, and who would you use as a reference? You talked to me about the Funk Brothers, the Wrecking Crew. Say you give them homework.
Yes. Now, introducing session players is always well, first of all, it's the last choice. If you really can't do it with the players that you've got, then it's only right that you tell them, listen, if we're going to make a great record, we're going to have to bring in certain people to beef this up. Okay? And then I would tell them stories. I would say, okay, listen, so-and-so had to bring in so-and-so. Def Leppard had to bring in so and so. You know, the Eagles brought in so and so. So and so brought in so and so. And it all made their records better. It gave them hit records, right? And a lot of times the band just cares that they get credited on the record. And they will always get credited on the record because it's their record. And you have additional thank yous to the guys that did some session work. But, you know, it's fairly easy to overcome that. And people will realize when they do need help. So I think that's the way to deal with that.
Yourself personally, what was your transition from writer, performer to producer? And what I want to know specifically is, why did you want to produce? Was it control? Was it a vision? And when did that take place and how?
Okay, yeah, that's a fair question. And it's a good question. And I've thought about this from time to time. I started off, of course, as a musician. First of all, I was a musician. Probably for a good 6 years. Then I was very lucky to get a recording contract early on in my life. I was 21 years old, and I signed with a label, and we went in and we recorded an album and a couple of singles. And you know, I watched people work. I was always like a sponge, whether it was before as a musician, learning from other musicians or listening, or when I got into the studio. Then early on I got into being hired as a session player. So I was in the studio a lot, and I would observe what people were doing in the studio and how they were doing it. And I started to understand some of the concepts. And I think maybe around 1973, I had probably done 50 or 60 sessions at that point. And a lot of commercials and things like that, or playing on this guy's record or playing on that guy's record. And I had the opportunity to actually produce a jingle that I had written, and I had a good relationship with the engineer. It worked well, and that was sort of the kickoff from there. And from there I would start taking the odd thing, and as I got more confident, I took on more difficult jobs. And then that's essentially how I became a producer. Now, different people do it different ways. You can certainly take courses or you can read books or whatever. But I still think the best way to become a producer is to actually live the life, walk the walk before you talk the talk. Well, okay, you know, today's producers, again, fall into two categories. There's the new music producers that are doing, you know, hip hop, dance music. A lot of that is done with loops today. It's not even done with musicians. You know, it's a guy with a keyboard that'll develop a loop, you know, and let's loop that. Let's get a beat from a machine that drives into that, right? And over top of that, they'll do rap lyrics. There isn't a whole lot of production there, except for making sure that the quality of the sound is dead on. And most of these guys, they know, because that's all they do. They're not diversified like the old-time producers that would produce a rock record. They'd produce a country record. They'd produce a folk record. They'd produce jingles. They'd produce music for film. You know, it's a different concept altogether. But then you still have the old-time producers, guys like Ahmet Ertegun or, you know, Tommy Maioldi, or guys like that are still like old-time producers that still care about the songs, the performance, and the artist. But that's the difference between the two kinds of producers today. There's a new kind of producer today that's sort of been spawned out of electronic keyboards, computer recording, digital recording, MP3s. I'm still the analog guy. Again, what I'd like to reiterate as I come to a close on this subject is that, again, for me, as a music-oriented producer, the most important thing when we get to the final stages of the recording and the mixing is to have an engineer that I can absolutely trust. And I know I've said that before, but I'm going to say it 2 more times. An engineer I can trust. An engineer that will take direction. And then also to have an artist that I feel I can work with that will take everything out of me that I can give him to make him sound better. And remember, when you're hiring a producer, a lot of times budget will come into factor, but figure out what your budget is and then sort of see what producers you can find that fall into that budget, and then listen to their work. Have a chat with them. Producers are like every other musician, you know, they love to yak. So have a nice chat with him. See the vibe that you get off the guy. Play him a song, and he won't mind listening to a song and say, now, what would you do? What do you think? You know, and they'll be honest with you. It's now all up to you. Find a producer.
I was down at the station waiting for the 6:30 to Tulsa, when along came a lady. She said, son, have you got $10? I'll take all the pain that you hold deep in your eyes. I said, that sounds fine, but I'll have to decline, 'cause I don't even have a dime. But obviously, you must be some kind of professional savior.